I'm a little bit disappointed couldn't be there in person because it'd just be so nice to see you all again. But unfortunately, I no longer reside in Toronto. But I'm very pleased to be here to talk about some of the work that I did over the last 6 years, actually, the vast majority of it in Toronto. And I'm very happy to have you all joining me here tonight. So I prepared just a pretty brief presentation with some text heavy slides. And I'm really glad for Luke's introduction because I really think that this could and should be considered an academic love letter to Civic Tech Toronto, but we'll get more into that in a moment. So what I'm going to tell you about today is 2 of the 3 articles that comprise my dissertation research. The third one being about Sidewalk Toronto, and nobody wants to hear about that, so we're not going to talk about it. I'm going to start by going over the motivations for the research, the general approach. Then I'm going to cover the first article that was published, Civic Space and Collaborative Commons, which was published in the Journal of Pure Production in 2022, I think. And then the second article for today, the third article in the dissertation, Beyond Transactional Democracy, a study of civic tech in Canada, which is going to be published in the 2003 ACM journal, Computer Supported Cooperative Work. And then we're just going to go some concluding thoughts, tensions, questions, whatever I left in the final slide after my kind of frantic editing process. Such as it is. So what motivated me to do this research? I wanted to know, well, I guess maybe I should start with a little bit of who I am and why I'm asking these kinds of questions. And I'm really glad that there's quite a few people that I don't know in this meeting because, I was hoping I wouldn't have to just kind of introduce myself to a bunch of people who probably have seen me around and know who I am and are like, okay. My name is Curtis. I've been coming to Civic Tech since 2015. I remember some really early small meetings. I remember some really big meetings. It was probably most active between 2015 to 2017, taking a break between 2017 and 19, and then picking up really again in 2019 to 2021. But I always, when I was attending these events, coming to Hacknights, meeting the people, working on the projects and everything, I was like, this is important stuff that's happening. There's all sorts of people coming in talking about civic tech and how it's like interesting. It's going to change the way that governments work, the way that cities work, the way that technology is designed, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, well, great. That sounds like something worth studying because I'm very interested in how people can participate in democratic decision-making. I wanted to know how Civic Tech in Toronto enabled and connected people to democratic institutions and processes. And I noticed that people were doing this with kind of this new focus on technology that was really kind of broadening the sets of skills that people could bring to the table. It wasn't just knowledge of facts and issues about specific topics and so on. It was really a kind of more distributed form of knowledge. I wanted to know how technology development came into play during the civic tech process. What's the tech in civic tech? What does it have to tell us about the way that technology is designed by governments or by other organizations? And then I wanted to know, well, what does this mean for citizenship? Because I'm very interested in the way that power is configured in democracy. So that means I'm really interested in the roles that people can play in the civic processes that kind of govern their lives, in the decision-making institutions that they participate in. In my past research, I've studied things like budget talks and sidewalk labs and these big, long, formal participation processes. And I wanted to see then, okay, so how does Civic Tech Toronto conceive of citizenship? What kind of civic actors, what kind of citizens is a place like this creating and supporting? So with these slightly more academically worded in the all the different drafts of them I've done, I went into doing some research. I wanted to bring a variety of theories and methods to play because I am a shameless multi-methodologist, a shameless pragmatist, and that's mostly because I can never seem to stick with anything. In systems thinking, we talk about this sweeping in problem of boundary judgments where everything can be relevant in some way or another, but that's why I have supervision to drive me in. I brought in some theories from systems thinking. I brought in some concepts from situational analysis, it's called an STS, and from social worlds thinking. You can have those words, but you don't really need to know what they're up to. We can talk about that later. In terms of methods, I did interviews, I did document analysis, I did workshops, and I participated in the work of Civic Tech Toronto. I didn't want to just kind of, well, it's very difficult when you already know a lot of the people you're going to be researching. I mean, I once met an anthropologist and she was like, wow, come on, Curtis, you research your friends? That's like impossible. How are you ever going to say mean things about them? And I was like, well, that's not really my intention. But nonetheless, I couldn't just kind of sit idly by and research Civic Tech because it's a community that like really benefits from volunteer work. So I wanted to participate in that work. And so I kind of adopted this framework of action research that I would bring to the table. Now, here's a big old picture for you. Basically, action research is just a way of doing academic research where you bring your academic theories, your academic frameworks into a real world situation, something that's happening. I like to talk about it by saying I'm really interested in other people's problems. I'm really interested in what other people are up to, what they do, how they see the world, how they navigate it, and the things that they build together. And I'm interested in helping them wherever I can. That's kind of what motivates me, and that's how I like to do my research. So I wanted to take part in the work of organizing Hacknights and experiencing what people were doing in Civic Tech Toronto in a way that was a little bit more directed and official than I had been doing for the years prior. And then I wanted to kind of reflect on it and see what kind of role that Civic Tech Toronto played in the kind of, not only in the world of Civic Tech, but in the world of Toronto as well. And then I wanted to take these findings and publish them into some sweet research papers, because I thought that the stuff that was going on at Civic Tech Toronto was really good. It was really interesting. And it needed to be kind of on the record, so to speak. That's kind of how I wanted to say it. I wanted to do what I can to make sure that this stuff got documented. And so over the next, I co-organized Hacknights for 18 months with people. I think that was from, let's say, September 2019 to 2020, sometime in 2022, I think. I'm not really sure. Sorry. I interviewed 12 Civic Tech organizers and community members, and talked with I like to think I also did a lot of conversations with people that were less formal than interviews. I helped everybody set up the transition to virtual Hacknights, which is why we have the wonderful format that we do today. That was just, I have to admit, COVID changed a lot of my plans. It changed a lot of my methods, changed a lot of what I thought I could get done. But nonetheless, like, I think, I don't know, Civic Tech's still here, and that just never fails to make me smile. It's just so fantastic to see you all in that little room together after we were just on Zoom for so long. Actually, your room looks pretty big. So to me, it's just a tiny box though. I ran some workshops to discuss the research as it was in progress, to discuss topics like virtual Hacknights, accessibility, etc. Some of these results are published alongside the Journal of Peer Production paper, which you can see. I'll link to all those probably when I stop doing this presentation. We organized some special events, the 250th Hacknight. Skydra and I presented at GovZero Taiwan. Skydra and John and I did a podcast together. And then out of all that kind of rolled up together, I published some papers. So the first one is for the Journal of Peer Production. I'm sorry if you're in this picture and your face is covered by text. I just want to say I'm really sorry to all those people whose face is covered by text. Jim, you're kind of just getting out of there, but in this case, I had been very interested by conversations I had with people like Patrick Connolly, who some of you may know, who's very interested in concepts of commons and peer production. Some of you may have heard these terms. Basically, commons-based peer production is a way of understanding organization and production that relies on the non-proprietary, non-market-driven production of resources and products and things like this in order to develop a kind of transitional market. We can talk about it more later, as I said, in the breakouts. But the most important part about what the commons means for this is it's a way of governing. It's a way of community governance. And I was always very interested, and we always had many conversations at Civic Tech Toronto because it's kind of a confusing place. And if it's your first time here, if it's your second time here, and you're like, what the heck is this place? How does this work? Many people have this feeling. I still, for many years, in fact, as somebody who likes to think about organizations, was confused. I was like, well, how exactly can we understand Civic Tech Toronto as an organization? It has very few kind of formal governance systems, except for like a kind of consensus among co-organizers who are all horizontally kind of arranged. It's kind of, so it solicits volunteers from inside the community to get all its work done. And it kind of, it's run by members of the same people who make it up. So I wanted to know if the language of commons could help us make sense of this. I wanted to know if making sense of Civic Tech Toronto in terms of this language, and I don't want to say that Civic Tech Toronto is a commons. That's not the intent. That wasn't the intention of this paper. And there's several actually, fairly decent paragraphs explaining why I didn't want to do this. I wasn't interested in evaluating Civic Tech in terms of this framework. I was interested in seeing if this language could fit, and if we applied this language, what could come out of it? Could we challenge or strengthen theories of the commons, these kind of more academic or more niche theories about economic transition and democratic governance and the way that we make technology? And then I wanted to know, well, okay, so if we make this empirical account and description, and then we kind of apply it to the theory to maybe do some critique, well, what does it suggest about how civic tech as a whole could maybe move forward in Canada, Toronto, beyond? So to answer the first question, does the language of commons make sense to talk about Civic Tech Toronto? I said, yes, I think it does. Because in terms of governance and production, I thought it made sense in terms of governance because Civic Tech Toronto is really governed by its community members in a way that I think is really, I would say, nicely, elegantly done, even if it seems at some time to be a little bit less efficient than some people may like at times. It's a non-hierarchical and voluntary group that's based on the creation of social relationships. I think one thing that I became very interested in talking about during this paper, and then towards the subsequent one, is how Civic Tech Toronto was really focused on creating networks of people and relationships that could share knowledge and expertise. It was about creating a community and a community as a resource that people could kind of reciprocally contribute to and draw from in a way to kind of get help with their projects, to build partners and allies, and to find other people with similar interests, to find community, to find, all these sorts of different good things that we look for and we don't necessarily find in a similar package, not in such a kind of, unique space and time. I thought, yes, we can use this to critique the theory. Commons-based peer production, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to gloss over a lot of this because, I'm condensing a 10,000 word paper here. So bear with me. If you have questions, the Q&A, I'm happy to answer them, and I'm happy to stay afterwards and talk about them. Commons-based peer production has this idea of a partner state. So it wants to say, look, we have all these ways of producing technologies and products that are based around hierarchies. They're based around private ownership. They're based around firms. We think they should be based around commons, so that people should decide where their labor goes, what they make, and how it's distributed. And how are we going to get there? Oh, well, they say we should use the state to get there. We should use governments to support the development of cooperative forms, to support the development of commons. We should use policy to do this. I argued in this paper that commons-based peer production was still focused on cooperative firms. It was still focused on the idea of a productive endeavor. And that you could have a commons that wasn't necessarily focused on the production of a product or resource, but still revolved around technology. And I argued that Civic Tech Toronto was a kind of example of this because it produces community, because it produces relationship. It produces a social body that has its own kind of life, but it's not focused on producing a technology product necessarily. Although, of course, as we know from our time at Civic Tech Toronto, sometimes that happens, and that's fantastic. I argue that using this, we can kind of understand the trade-off between informal and formal civic tech organizing. So I make an argument in this paper about how you can have informal civic tech groups like Civic Tech Toronto that have the benefits of being inclusive. They have the benefits of being lean. They have benefits, and we'll get into this a bit later, of being less accountable to another higher body. But there comes with a trade-off here. They are not as legible as partners for states. So it's very difficult to say, make a partnership with Civic Tech Toronto because it doesn't have a board of directors. It doesn't have staff members or a kind of director or a funding source or an address or a bank account. It relies on people giving in kind through its social networks. It relies on people in the community to supply it with venues, to supply it with speakers and all of that. There's a lot of benefits to this, but there's also, of course, some trade-offs. But commons-based peer production is really interesting because it talks about an ecosystem for making these. It talks about productive communities, the kinds of people that come to a commons and want to use their skills to make things. It talks about the way that these people are organized around different projects or products in terms of an entrepreneurial coalition. And then it talks about entities that are situated above those coalitions, groups that are more structured than commons, that act on their behalf and try and engage with states or with other organizations to kind of protect and grow those commons, which is called a for-benefit association. Here, I argue that at Civic Tech Toronto, we can see the kind of way that productive communities are supported through Civic Tech Toronto and even invited to form more entrepreneurial coalitions in the form of projects. Where we struggle a little bit is to find a for-benefit association to advocate and push on a structural level for this. We see this through advocacy from community members all the time, in the sense of people from the civic tech community are really vocal advocates around, say, procurement reform in government. But they do this kind of through their own trajectories rather than as part of the kind of civic tech official stream. All that's to say, I became very interested in how civic tech produces things and what it produces. This brings us to the final, the next paper, which is more focused on civic tech's contributions to civic life. So I argue that civic tech produces these kinds of things in this kind of way. It's focused on relationships. It's focused on non-hierarchical forms of organizing. But what does it offer? What's it have to say about the civic life? What's it have to say about technology development? Getting back to some of our earlier questions. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the way that, and to use academic terms, we're talking, civic tech is a way of supporting what could be called micropublics or publics. So in academic parlance, or I guess within, say, some HCI work, when a group of people come to organize themselves around an issue and make an intervention, it's called a public. So you're looking at this chart, and I can share you SVG if you want of this. But this is basically, you see the chart on the right here. This is Civic Tech Toronto in the center, and this is just a few kind of vague issue groups that I kind of, roughed out. This is a drafting map, but I put it up because it's a flashy visual. It's not really designed to be it's not the end of analysis. It's a stage in the middle. But what I wanted to show with this is how all these different civic tech projects, all these different small little micro publics formed and made interventions into different sorts of issues. On the outside of that Civic Tech Toronto circle are all these other groups that aren't connected to Civic Tech Toronto directly, but maybe have crossover, et cetera. And you could fill all of those circles with hundreds, dozens of groups or whatever. What I wanted to show here is that Civic Tech Toronto is in a niche group. It supports engagement in all sorts of civic issues. It supports people pursuing whatever they think is relevant to their city or to their democracy. And it kind of and it is in conversation with a whole bunch of other different kinds of groups as well. I mean, really, this map is 2% the size it could be, because it's just a small selection of the civic tech projects, and it's a small selection of the other groups and projects that I encountered during my time. Now, civic tech, in a way, can do this because since the beginning, it's wanted to connect people with different kinds of expertise together. What's called a contact zone. A across what's called a social world. So what Civic Tech does is it brings people together and starts to create a common vocabulary between them. It starts getting all these people with tech expertise, with government expertise, with activist expertise, with consulting expertise. And over time, through their association, they start to learn how to talk to one another. They start to be able to actually understand each other in ways that they might not have understood. I mean, I don't know how often you have this experience, say, if you're a developer and you meet someone from the business side or vice versa, if you're a policy person and you meet someone on a legal team or a tech team, it's not always so easy to talk across those kind of boundaries. But in Civic Tech, there's a social kind of setting that kind of puts people on ease. There's not really that many expectations. And over time, it lets these people talk to each other in a way that feels safe and casual and comfortable, and where we can interact in a productive way. I was especially interested in the way that civilians, or just regular, people that weren't in government, I say civilians because I don't want to say citizens, because many people participate in public discourse without being proper citizens. So I try to use the word civilians in this, and public servants are brought together. It's not often if you're an active person, that you're going to be encountered, that you're going to meet public servants, that you're going to be able to talk to public servants and people that work for government, who actually write the policies, who actually administer them. You're not necessarily going to encounter them. And certainly you're not going to be encountering them unless they're, say, across the table from you. But you do at Civic Tech Toronto. You do all the time. In fact, the room might be full of public servants. That to me was always very interesting. Now, by acting as this kind of community resource that we talked about before, this kind of civic commons, with all this expertise and dynamic kind of energy coming up, that's what allows these projects to grow, through the sharing of knowledge, because you have all these kind of dynamic combinations and people with interests. And some people say, oh, I like that. It's kind of quasi-random in a way. One of the things that I start there's a kind of decision making that's kind of called garbage can, where the problems and solutions are kind of randomly thrown into the equation. Like the people that come in are environmental in Civic Tech Toronto. You can't really guarantee who's going to come any given night. You can't guarantee what people are going to want to be into that night. You're not forcing anybody to do anything. And that kind of that has its kind of, downsides in some ways, but in other ways, it means that people can choose what to do. It means that people decide and they lead their own community. They decide what's interesting to them and they pursue it based on that. Working on a project at Civic Tech is always consensual, right? Because you don't have to show up. It's not like the person who is leading a meeting for a project is your boss. You should show up because you want to be there, because you're interested to be there, because you feel like you're contributing, which is not the way that's not the way that most people experience work and labor. And it's also not the way that people experience a lot of civic engagement, where the terms are set by somebody who has a very formalized task of running and getting feedback, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all this kind of creates an environment for what I think is one of the most important parts of Civic Tech. And insofar as I wanted to make this argument that Civic Tech Toronto is a great example of something that's more civic than tech. In academic publications, civic tech is often talked about in terms of technologies, which means that when people talk about civic tech, they're talking about a specific technological artifact, a system, an application, a website, a project that does something. Then that something is a civic thing. What defines the civic? That's a matter of contestation. What defines a technology? Well, it's usually a digitized system that relies on some kind of networking architecture and advanced interface technology, or mapping, or whatever have you. And I thought, well, people in the computer science field are really concerned about these technological artifacts. They're really concerned about the technologies that are civic technologies. But Civic Tech Toronto kind of, to me, always stood at odds with that, because as people were fond of saying, it's 90% civic, 10% tech. And that's a very important part of Civic Tech Toronto, or it was or in my opinion, it is. Technology at Civic Tech Toronto can play a really interesting role, because it's not necessarily It's not the only sole focus. People don't come here and somebody stands at the front of the room and says, this is what we're designing. Here's the project. This is what we're working on tonight. Like, we've got to get this out, this kind of time frame. These are the requirements. This is what's needed, et cetera. That can happen in the projects, but like, that's not seen as necessary to create those tangible outcomes as Civic Tech Toronto. Technology plays a role as a kind of learning device at Civic Tech Toronto, where technology becomes a way, or discussing technology or designing technology becomes a way about learning about social issues and a way about learning how people can get involved in their civic areas. Technology design here is a form of civic engagement, because if we're designing an application about the TTC, or we're collecting data, say we're collecting data about the TTC, or we're designing, or we're reading about a new software system that the city is rolling out or something, we need to understand technologies. And as we understand those, we're engaging with these issues. We're starting to understand them, and perhaps we're making more significant interventions, say if we do eventually, if we do run some programs, if we do tabs on, if we do all these sorts of different projects that have happened at Civic Tech Toronto over the day. And in this way, I argue, we create, like, Civic Tech Toronto supports people in terms of participating in civic life. It gives them the kind of literacies and confidence and capacities that they might need to engage outside of Civic Tech Toronto with these civic issues, or just continue to engage at Civic Tech Toronto. It equips people for organizing work because they can, perform as organizers. It gives them vocabularies in tech development and design and all these sorts of things that they'll need if they're gonna approach civic issues, because there's a lot of these civic issues that are really enmeshed in the design of technology. A lot of new policies are come out as kind of technology changes, or there's a new system coming out, or it's Sidewalk Labs comes in and people need ways to understand this, or the TTC needs to be understood, and we do that through data. Like, technology has become a way of understanding, but unless regular people can come to those understandings, unless the people who have that expertise, whether it be public servants or technologists, unless they can share them with everyone else, then they're kind of denied access and literacy. So Civic Tech Toronto becomes this kind of environment where people can learn about that in a really nice, casual way. So what is this kind of, we're going to wind to a conclusion here. What does it kind of say about digital civics and citizenship? Well, I argue that governance and policymaking increasingly involves software design development. It leverages public assets and data, and it uses software. It's online. It involves digital infrastructure plans. It involves Sidewalk Labs and smart cities. And so understanding technology and understanding how technology development works is important to understanding how governance works. Civic Tech Toronto contributes to this by creating a stable and a time and place without expectations or hierarchies. There are not a lot of places where you can go and engage in this kind of what could be called a modality. When you show up to Civic Tech Toronto, like, yes, it's social, but you're also expecting to talk about civic issues with strangers, with other people whose only connection to you is that they might have similar interests, but their main connection is that you share the same civic setting, you share the same city. And that's not a typical experience, I found, at least, and perhaps you have other examples, but it's incredibly valuable in my opinion, that Civic Tech Toronto is able to create and maintain this space every Tuesday night for 6 years, where people can come together and in that time they're citizens, so to speak, in Toronto, and there's no expectations placed on them. They don't have to deliver anything. They don't have to necessarily come prepared unless they decide to be. There's no hierarchy there. They don't have to worry about jockeying. They can take the roles that interest them. They can contribute in the ways that they're comfortable with, and they contribute as equals, hopefully. I mean, there's other things going on, of course. People have lots of different ways to make claims of, like, legitimacy, et cetera, but like, we can talk about that as a kind of corollary. Another example, and I want to come back to this point about building relationships between public servants and civilians, is it's a place to kind of build trust and to have, like, this channel of communication open. How many times has the city come to Civic Tech and said, oh, we have this thing and we want to present it to Civic Tech because we know like we're going to get a receptive and engaged audience. There were times such as, for example, there's a bit of an eye roll here, but the ConnectTO, the digital strategic, Sam might know the acronym, the digital innovation strategy or the digital strategic innovation framework or whatever they ended up calling it. There were times when the city was coming to Civic Tech and people were kind of, and talking about that directly. There's lots of public servants who come to Civic Tech to share the work that they're doing, to talk to people who are interested, to talk to people who are experts in this field. It makes these boundaries a little bit more porous. To me, I am in some ways what you might call more direct Democrat, or ideally, I think that elected representatives have a role to fill, but maybe they're a little bit overloaded. It's public servants who have the expertise to like kind of write policies, and to them engaging with citizens, engaging with people and finding out and doing their research through participatory mechanisms helps them do their job better. And having publics like Civic Tech around helps them to kind of realize those goals. Most important, I just want to stress this again, this is a time outside of formal engagements. It's not a consultation. It's not an election. It's not a hackathon. It doesn't need to be anything. And that I think is one of the most important parts. It does not necessarily have to create what I call a transactional good. It doesn't need to create an object that you can say, this is what we made. This is what makes this thing worth it. Is here it is, and you can show it to somebody. It's a number, it's an application, it's a news story or whatever. It doesn't need to make those kinds of things. And part of that is because it's just the overhead, as long as you have energy and your volunteer base, is pretty low. And that's kind of how the magic happens. Now, I'll leave some concluding remarks here that we can maybe talk about later, but I'm going to go probably right to questions at this point. Just some questions to think about the trade-offs in Civic Tech. There's obviously kind of, pros and cons to the way that Civic Tech Toronto does stuff, but it's how we've gotten this far. And I think 6 years is really impressive to see something with this frequency, this vigor, even in Civic Tech. I'm not sure when we might be the last Civic Tech group standing at some point. It might be in another 15 years, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's unique in its flexibility, its nonpartisan status, its casual, experimental, and social atmosphere. But how can we think about how we translate that civic learning and this kind of thing into more civic action, more direct intervention in our civic environment? How can we turn these contact zones into space where we can build coalitions? How can we bring more people into the fold, especially people who really could benefit from allies with expertise, with allies with design expertise, tech expertise, policy expertise, et cetera? Where do elected officials fit in? They're just so absent from almost everything that all my civic engagement work, elected officials only show up to make a kind of half-baked speech. That seems like as far as I ever encountered with them, which is kind of frankly shocking. So that's a question I'll leave you with. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to pause for a few seconds so you can end the recording if you like.